Lillian Smith was born in 1897 in Jasper, a small North Florida town near the Georgia border and the vastness of the Okefenokee Swamp. That swamp was a deep, mysterious, and fertile place, and seemed to have a special presence in the equally fertile mind of Lillian Smith. She spoke of its mysterious waters and wildlife as a mirror of the creative spirit with its often strange and mythic power. Her family moved to Raymond County, Georgia in Lillian's late teenage years, and she remained a citizen of Clayton until she died. The editor of her collected letters, Rose Gladney, says of her, "The story of Lillian Smith, novelist, essayist, and outspoken liberal activist, is that of a woman working to reconstruct the world, to create not just a place for herself in the world, but a world where she could find meaning and be heard." At the core of her being was her life as an artist, and that life flowed seamlessly into her social activism. She was a gifted and powerful best-selling and award-winning writer, a tireless public advocate for human and civil rights in a time and place where many remained silent. The day after she died, an homage to her by Eugene Patterson appeared in the Atlanta Constitution. In his words, "Because she was an artist, she told the truth. In telling it, she never despaired of the human condition. She always believed in the power of the human heart. Her own is silent now, but the life she lived made hers the death of a very beautiful woman." Many words have been written and spoken about Lillian Smith, but her own words offer the most eloquent encounter with her. Hear them now.
I don't remember exactly how or when, but by the time I had learned that God is love, that Jesus was his son and came to give us more abundant life, and that all men are brothers with a common Father in heaven, I had also been taught that I was better than a Negro, that all black folks have their place and must be kept in it, and that a terrifying disaster would befall the South if I ever treated a Negro as my social equal. I had also learned that it is possible to be both a Christian and a white Southerner simultaneously. To pray at night and ride a Jim Crow car in the morning and feel comfortable doing both. I learned these things the way all my Southern people learned them then, by closing door after door until my mind, my heart, and my conscience were cut off from each other and from reality. I closed those doors, or perhaps they were closed for me, but I was lucky. Somewhere along the way, they began to open again. My father used to tell us, you have your heritage, some of it good, some of it not so good. But the past has been lived, it is gone, it is over. The future is yours. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Looking back, I think he was trying his best to give all of his children a sense of wholeness in spite of the divided society we had all had to learn to live in. I was born and reared in a small, deep South town, the population of which was about equally Negro and white. There were 9 of us. I had 5 brothers and 3 sisters, and I was third from last, followed by my sister Esther, who became one of my closest lifelong friends. We were aware that we were a respected and important family in town, and we were given such advantages of schooling, music, and art as were available in the South at that time. we were trained to think that learning was important, and that each of us should be grateful for our opportunities and grow up to do something of genuine usefulness. And though we were well supplied with both, we were also told 10,000 times that status and money were not important, and that all men are brothers. We were told that the teachings of Jesus are important and could be practiced if we tried. But we were also told that to be radical is bad, and that first one must conform to the best behavior of one's community, and then try to make it better if one could. All of us children read the Bible in its entirety every year, and memorized hundreds of Bible verses, and we had family prayers every day. God was a permanent member of our household, not just someone we encountered on Sunday. And it never occurred to me until I was a teenager that he was not chalking up my daily scores on eternity's tablets. But despite the strain of living so intimately with God on a daily basis, the 9 of us were strong, healthy, and energetic youngsters who filled the day with play and sports and music and books and managed to live our lives most of the time on the careless and happy level at which young lives should be lived. Our father owned large business interests, employed hundreds of colored and white laborers, paid them the prevailing low wages, worked them the prevailing long hours, built separate mill towns and churches for Negroes and whites, saw to it that the commissary supplied commodities at high prices, and, in general, managed his affairs much as 10,000 other Southern businessmen managed theirs at the time. But in 1915, everything changed for us. Our father's businesses collapsed, mainly due to shipping blockades imposed during World War I. He lost almost everything, including our home, the big rambling house and yard where we had all spent such a happy childhood. All that was left was a piece of mountain property he had bought a few years earlier in Clayton, Georgia. It was saved because he had deeded it to our mother. When I graduated from high school that very same year, 2 of my brothers and my sister Esther and I moved with our parents and some dogs, chickens, and a cow permanently to Screamer Mountain. Everything was different, and it would never be the same again. Things were hard all over the South. We were not alone in being poor, and it all got worse instead of better as time passed. As Christmas approached, Esther and I agreed just to pretend it wasn't coming and spend the day like any other with no expectations. But our father, who had always reminded us that it was still much harder for most others than it was for us, well, he saw it differently, as he usually did. One day, as he was walking home from town after bartering some eggs for cornmeal, he stopped to visit with the prisoners on a chain gang who were working on the state roads nearby and were temporarily housed in a siding in 2 shabby railroad cars. He came home much distressed about their living conditions, looked into my mother's eyes, and said, "Mama, how about having them all out here for Christmas? Wouldn't that be nice?" There was a very long silence. But my gentle mother finally nodded yes. And my father walked all the way back into town to invite the prisoners and the guards to Christmas dinner. And the foreman said, "All of them?" And my father replied, "Well, we couldn't hardly leave any of those boys out now, could we?" Well, close to noon on Christmas Day, we saw them coming up the road. 48 men in stripes. Both white and Negro, carefully watched by their guards. It was an unusually warm and sunny day, thank goodness, so the men were able to all sit out on the grass in front of the house, while the guards leaned against the trees, keeping watch with guns in their hands. Some of the men were laughing and talking, but a lot of them were quiet, and they looked grim and suspicious. Esther and I had helped Mother make caramel cakes and sweet potato pies, hot rolls, a rice and backbone dish, and a big pot of Brunswick stew. And we had a wash tub full of apples that my father had polished in front of the fire the night before. I know my mother had to be wondering what in the world would be left in the house for the family to eat in January. Well, we were inside getting out the china when we heard a hush fall outside, and then our father's voice reading the nativity story from St. Luke. So we eased out onto the porch to listen. We had been warned that 10 of the prisoners were killers. One had bashed in his own grandmother's head. 2 had robbed banks. 3 had stolen cars. 1 had burned down his neighbor's house and gone after an argument, and another one had done a rape. But just now, all of them were sitting there together and quietly listening to that old story. When my father finished and closed the Bible, he smiled and said, "Now, boys, eat plenty, let's have us a good time. We're proud to have you today, so let's all just have us a Merry Christmas." Well, at first, just a few of the men started looking around and kind of muttering Merry Christmas to each other. But you know, before long, they all seemed to catch on to the wonderful absurdity of the situation. And soon everybody joined in, smiling and laughing, and so did we. And when Mother said she was ready, our father asked one of the killers to go help her with the heavy things. And that young man said he'd be mighty glad to. Then the one in for raping and another for robbing a bank said they'd be pleased to help too. My sister and I followed them into the house, not feeling quite as casual as we hoped we looked. When 2 guards moved with their guns to go in too, my father stopped them and said, "Nope, those boys will be all right." And you know they were. They brought the big pots and pans out to a serving table we had set up on the porch. And my sister and I served the plates, and the murderer and 2 of his friends passed them out to the men. Afterwards, the car thief and the 2 bank robbers and the arsonist said they'd be real glad to do the washing up. But we told them nobody ought to wash dishes on Christmas, just have a good time. Which in fact, all of us did. That evening, after they had all gone, our family sat together by the fire, and my father talked about it. "Those men today," he said, "they've made mistakes. But I have too, and so will you. But the one I most hope you won't make is to cling to the sins of my generation. You are not likely to commit a crime, but you may become blind and refuse to see what you should see. Not changing things, if you can think of something better to change them to, is worse than a crime." And then he said, "Mama, I believe I'll go to bed. You about ready?" She nodded, and they got halfway up the stairs, and then he stopped, and he turned around, and he looked straight at me, and he said, "But I don't mean, sister, that you got to get radical." Then he laughed, and they went on up to bed. I must admit that there have been times in the years since when I have wondered if I should not have taken that advice more to heart. Oh, up to this time, I'd been a dreamy kid with no real responsibility about much of anything. But I loved books, and I had a consuming curiosity about everything, and I wanted to know all about how people lived and what they thought about it and how they felt about everything, and I was always asking religious questions. Where did I come from? Where am I going? what is eternity? But I remember my Sunday school teacher finally laying down the law that I was never, ever to ask her that eternity question again. So I turned away from the church for answers, and I tried to find out everything I wanted to know elsewhere. I had read all of Shakespeare's plays by the time I was 10 or 11, and now I read authors like Defoe, Dickens, Thackeray, and Browning. Oh, plus a lot of shoddy books as well I love, like Elsie Dickens. And finally, I turned to music. I practiced piano 3 or 4 hours a day. I was saturated with Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, Schubert, and Mozart, and was assured by my family that I was exceptionally talented. And miraculously, that first hard year in Clayton, my parents somehow found a way to send me down to little Piedmont College in Dumfries, Georgia. I don't know how they did it. And my expectations for that small mountain school were not high, but I was in for a big surprise. The faculty was excellent. My teachers were from Harvard, Cornell, Yale, Smith, and Vassar, and the classes were small, only 2 in my math class, 3 in my Latin class, and never more than 25 even in French and English. I received excellent instruction there. And I can tell you that I have never seen better anywhere since. I now know how lucky I was to have been there that year. But I was young, and I was still living a rural life I could not quite accept, and I was longing for the wider world. As it would eventually turn out, I had been given far too much praise for what was really a small pianistic talent. But nonetheless, I dreamed of becoming a concert pianist. So in 1917, I left Georgia for Baltimore to work my way through Peabody Conservatory. I found a place to live in a Dickensian establishment called the Margaret Bennett Home for Students and Working Girls. This was run by a very nosy house mother, but it was cheap as I paid only $6 a week for room and board. I worked as an accompanist to pay my way, and I dated boys from Johns Hopkins, and I suffered terribly from the cold. And I loved it, even though I was appalled to learn how little I knew in compared to so many other students. I did have to come back to Georgia for a while in 1918 to save some money, and I taught for 4 months in a 2-room school in Tiger, Georgia. I was 20 years old, and I was also principal of the school, as the principal before me had been shot by one of the older boys. Needless to say, there was not a very good esprit de corps when I arrived. But I remembered my own childhood and tried to make it fun. I learned how to teach that winter. We had a fine time together, all of us. And then I went back to Peabody for 3 more years. But by 1922, it was clear to everyone that my musical abilities did not match my grand dreams. Do you know something which turned out to be extraordinary in my life did happen? I was offered a job to go to China and teach piano and harmony to young Chinese girls in the missionary school in Puchao. I accepted, of course. And the 3 years that I spent there in China started me growing on every level of human experience. By then, of course, I was an agnostic, but I was a good teacher. So they accepted me as I was, and I was drawn deep into a way of life that was all new to me. I was the youngest person on the faculty and one of only 5 American women. Some of them suffered from acute loneliness living so far from home in an ancient and alien culture. And they found themselves drawn into secret, passionate, and forbidden relationships with each other for comfort. I had never been exposed before to such a dark and intense emotional atmosphere. And I was deeply, deeply affected by the things that I saw and heard there. And outside the school, quiet arrogance was everywhere. And, like colonialism in all of its manifestations, smoothed over by Christian talk, but poisoned by unchristian acts. The British and Americans completely segregated the Chinese, even the Christian Chinese. We would pray with them, but we wouldn't play with them. There was poverty on a level which I found shocking, but I succumbed over and over to the enchantment of the landscape, the sheer beauty of the art and architecture, the sounds of temple bells and drums, and the elegant charm of the people. It was like a giant stage set of a whole way of life I'd never dreamed of before, and I could not take my eyes and ears off the show. I was confronted with Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism for the first time, and all of this was during the last years of Sun Yat-sen's life, when China was breaking to pieces, and we were surrounded by the constant violent threat of warlords who were struggling with each other for power. My mind and my senses came wide awake in Asia. When I came home 3 years later, I was not the same. I did not want to come back to Georgia. But I had no choice. I came back in response to an SOS from my parents who were not well. A few years earlier, my father had started a camp for girls, Laurel Falls, on the grounds of our mountain home, but had grown too old and weak to direct it, and needed me to take it over, as it provided necessary income for the family. I returned with great reluctance and a huge, huge sense of loss for the magic of China. But there were responsibilities I had to assume, regardless of my own wishes. So I began to grow up a little. Though I didn't know it then, I was coming home for good and would run that camp for the next 25 years. My career in music? Forgotten. I was acutely miserable, and so I began to write. I remember thinking I must write, I really must write. But I had no idea what to write about or how to go about it. And here is where Paula Snelling began to mean a great deal in my life. She had come to work for my father at the camp when I was in China, and then stayed on to work with me. She was very well educated and intensely interested in poetry and books, and I was drawn to that. We read together and we discussed literature and ideas for hours on end. I began to ask her to read what I had written, and she'd encourage me. And without that encouragement, I doubt if I would have had the guts to go through those first years of groping. Paula was the only person in my life who ever appealed to my mind and my heart simultaneously. In the early 1930s, we began to spend winters together in an apartment in Macon, Georgia, where Paula was a high school math teacher. I was very happy to find myself becoming an important part of the liberal intellectual community there at the time. And in 1935, I was actually elected president of the Macon Writers Club, which I felt at the time to be a very prestigious position. But in the summer of that same year, Paula suffered a nearly fatal riding accident and had to retire permanently from teaching due to her injuries. So we found ourselves, for the first time, coming back to live year-round at Laurel Falls. And since we could not get out to the world anymore, we decided to try to bring a bit of the world to us. So in 1936, we began a little magazine together, which we ended up calling South Today. We published it with pennies left over from the can and never had any financial help from the outside. I was able to do a lot of writing for it, and it grew and lived for 10 years and had 10,000 subscribers by the time we decided it had served its purpose. I am afraid we fancied ourselves young rebels who were just out to destroy a lot of worn-out cliches in Southern society, but we were searching for something real and valid too. We learned a lot about the South, much about human relations, and a lot more about writers and writing, and it was a great experience. And in lieu of payment sometimes, we were able to invite our contributors to come up and stay with us on the mountain as our guests. 1936 was the year we had our very first biracial house party, and those gatherings continued. We wanted to exchange ideas and learn from each other and think about how we could change the future. We were changing the camp too. You know, I laugh when people call me an extremist, because it took me 10 years to do what I wanted to do at the camp. But it gradually did become a relaxed, creative, and progressive little community. We still had riding, tennis, swimming, archery, all the other usual competitive camp activities. But we also developed interest in sculpture, painting, modern dance, creative writing, and theatre, and especially in the regular and frank discussion of ideas and human problems. And even though we wanted it, and our campers begged for it, we never did have Negro children as campers, as the white parents simply would not allow it. So, instead, we would invite the colored children from the community up for visits, and we would have parties with them, and we would dance, and they would eat with us and sing, and sometimes spend the night. But that was absolutely as far as we were able to get it. And during all of these years, I was writing novels and novellas. I remember that I had written a novel at about 10 years old, which the grown folks had read aloud to each other with what seemed to me at the time unreasonable delight. It had not seemed at all funny to me when I wrote it. But in fact, the first piece of mine ever published was done so because the Macon Telegraph found it so funny, and they made a feature out of it. It was a ridiculous memoir about my car being searched by state police and revenue officers for liquor. They had mistaken me for a rum runner, and I was chased down and searched 3 different times. It was thrilling. The first real novel I wrote was about China. Just as I had seen it, felt it, smelled it, and touched it. It seemed to fascinate the publishers who read it, but all of them were shocked by it. I had simply written candidly about the human relationships I had observed there. And they all found it to be not only hair-raising, but exceptionally deviant. No one was ready to publish it, but then, of course, this was nearly 30 years before the work of Mr. Henry Miller made its appearance in America. I also wrote several novellas which were very frank and autobiographical, and decided not even try to get them published, because I did realize that some of my family might have been hurt by them. And then one day, I decided to write a very quiet book about life as I had known it in a small town as a child. So I started what became Strange Fruit and worked on it for almost 6 years. It was turned down by 10 editors who said it was simply not interesting. One of them did say that it might appeal at most to a possible handful of mature and thoughtful readers. To tell the truth, I rather agreed with him. So I laid it away on a shelf and forgot about it. But in 1943, a man named Frank Taylor, who was an editor for the publishing firm Reynolds and Hitchcock in New York, happened to hear about the manuscript from a mutual friend of ours. He came down to Georgia and asked to see it, so I just took it out and let him read it, just like it was. Several parts of it were still not finished. His firm accepted it within 36 hours, and it is now sold over 3 million copies in this country, has been translated into 15 languages, and is still selling. That it would shock anyone never crossed my mind. And I never dreamed of writing a book about race relations. To me, it was a simple story. A story of mothers and sons in search of each other. Of brothers and sisters who remain strangers forever. And of a white man and a black woman who love each other. Not according to the rules their culture dictates, but according to the deepest fantasies of their hearts. It was human experience that I wanted to write about. But as I was writing, I did begin to understand, as I never had before, the terrifying injury which segregation inflicts on both races, the barriers which shut people off from each other and from beauty and truth and grace and from life itself. I did what I always do. I tried to search for the truth as I wrote, and I put down only what I found. Well, the book began to sell like wildfire and was already a bestseller 3 weeks before its official publication date, which was February 29th, 1944. I was staying in Atlanta with my brother Joseph, who was minister of the big Methodist church at Emory University, and we were waiting for the review to come out in the Atlanta newspaper. He was calm on the surface, but I knew underneath he was every bit as jittery as I was. He had himself been rather deeply shocked when he read the book. And another brother had asked him, Joseph, but why? You're usually quite liberal about these things. And Joseph had answered, well, yes, but... Well, I just had no idea that Lil knew all of those words. Well, the review appeared in the Atlanta Journal and was not so good. Though the reviewer did say that it was the best dialect she'd ever seen in a Southern book. Of course, I felt greatly let down. But I actually think she was trying to be as nice as she felt she could be, though she was indeed damning me with faint praise. Well, as it happens, the very next day, the Atlanta mothers of some of my comers had planned a lovely luncheon for me in honor of the book's publication at the Capital City Club on Peachtree Street. I knew that none of them had read it yet. Well, the lunch was lovely, and just afterwards, one of the women suddenly chirped, "We're only a block away from Davison's, so let's just all walk down there and get copies of Miss Lil's book so she can autograph them for us." I was terrified. But I pretended to think it was an absolutely wonderful idea. So off to Davison's we went, and we marched right down the aisle to the book department, where not a single copy was to be seen. But one little lady said, "Now where is Miss Lil's book?" The sales lady actually blushed, dove under the counter, and came up with 2 or 3 copies. Well, the little lady said, that's a lot better, but we all want one. Well, about 12 ladies were there, so the thoroughly embarrassed sales lady kept diving until she brought up all 12 books. And then I heard, well, then, Miss Lil, you can autograph one right here for each and every one of us. And I did. Right there in Davison's, with my knees shaking, all the while wondering what in the world would they think of me when they finally took it home. But a few days later, enthusiastic reviews started appearing everywhere, including the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, and newspapers all over the country. Many more thousands of books started being sold, and so in late February, I flew to New York to celebrate, and was met at the airport by my publisher, who put a check for $5,000 in my hand and said, here's a little something to begin with. The only other time in my life I had seen that much money at once was when I had borrowed it from the bank, taking out a mortgage on my camp. But 1 month later, in March, Strange Fruit was banned in Boston. And this is how it happened. A man up there bought a copy to send his daughter at college for a birthday present. He took it home and read it first, and was so shocked by a particular 4-letter word in it that he called the police and told them it was indecent and should be banned. The police went after it the next day, looked at the word, and told all of the booksellers in Boston to stop selling it, which most of them did, immediately. Well, Bernard DeVoto, the famous editor at the time, was outraged and decided to put it to a legal test. So he deliberately bought a copy of it at a Cambridge bookstore from a man who had been warned that he might be arrested if he sold it to him. Well, he was right. Both of them were arrested, and it was going to court on obscenity charges. So before the trial, my publisher called up the police commissioner and asked him just what would Miss Smith have to do to make the book decent enough to be sold in Boston's bookstores. Well, the commissioner said, take out the 4-letter word, take out the raping scene, and take out the scene where the breast and the rump are mentioned. Well, of course, I refused. They went to court, lost the case, and for a very long time the book could not be sold anywhere in the state of Massachusetts. But many, many writers and columnists defended the book in print, and we got more and more publicity, and more books were selling all over the rest of the country. Oh, and there was also a banning by the U.S. Post Office, which lasted less than 3 days due to secret White House intervention. Bet you want me to tell you about that. In late March, an order went out forbidding the sending of publications advertising the book through the U.S. mail. Well, the newspapers immediately protested, writing stories, sending telegrams to the White House. And here is what happened next. My publisher, Mr. Hitchcock, called up Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, we both knew her at the time because we'd done some activist work together. And he flew to Washington at her invitation to have breakfast with her. After which, she talked to her husband over lunch. After which, he then, that afternoon, called up the big ones at the post office who must be talked to about such things. And by dinner time, a new notice was sent out rescinding the order. But by this time, the country was already reeling with it, and the book sales were shooting up like a rocket. It wasn't the banning itself that did it. But the reaction, the writers filling their columns day after day with stories about the book and about me. Well, I was a big celebrity in New York City for almost 2 years. Everybody recognized me. I loved taking my nephews and their dates and Esther and Paula to all the luxurious restaurants. And happily wasted lots of money at the Pierre and the Plaza and at 21. Fame and fortune did prove to be hard on creativity, hard on one's intelligence, and hard on one's habits of quiet study, to be sure. But all during that time, I tried my best to hold on to enough of my old life to keep me sane and real in what I truly felt that I was. And when I got back home to the mountain, for the first time, I had enough money to do some of the things I had always wanted to do in the camp. I made the most of it. I bought equipment that we sorely needed, especially for our theater. I paid off that camp's mortgage, and I helped every member of my family who needed any help. And damn it, I bought myself all the clothes I've been wanting ever since we lost all of our money when I was a teenager. But I kept my same old Chevrolet. And I never had a more expensive car, and I still lived in the cabins at the camp, and life went on exactly as it always had, except the debts were paid. And we could buy wine and whiskey and garlic olives and caviar. And I kept writing, though there was never ever to be another bestseller. You see, when Boston banned my book, it was legal. Everybody heard about it. And that helped to sell it a lot, even though we picked up a lot of second and third class readers instead of the first class readers we were aiming for. We picked up a lot of readers who bought the book just to see a word that you could see for free scrawled on a bathroom wall just about anywhere. Now, I have never understood why anybody would spend good money to buy a book just for that reason. Well, the South is very proud that it never officially banned my book. But it learned that to smother them was better than banning them, and that is what it began to do. By not reviewing them, by not having them in the stores to sell, and by not ever letting a good word appear in the papers about them. Now that is completely and highly effective censorship, something you can't get your fingers on, something you cannot take to court. In 1949, 5 years after Strange Fruit, I published my next book, a personal and sociological memoir called Killers of the Dream. This time the Atlanta Constitution did print something about it on the editorial page. The headline reads, "A new book, Strange Trout, and the opinion of Mr. Jack Tarver continues." Lillian Smith has written a new book, and brother, is it a stinker. You remember Lillian. She wrote Strange Fruit. This one should have been called Strange Literature. It's not a novel, nor could you call it nonfiction. It is, in short, neither fish nor fowl, though I must say it gives off the aroma of both. Lillian belabors one facet of an already shop-worn obsession for 256 pages, and when she is done, one wonders what in the name of obfuscation she was attempting to get at. Talk about your devious demagoguery. Not only is this claptrap, but very badly done claptrap. Look, don't get me wrong. Miss Smith is entitled to her racial views 1 trillion light years to the left of center though they may be. My quarrel is only with her method of expressing it, and with publishers who waste good ink, paper, and man-hours printing such truck. There is, I must admit, one aspect of the inexcusable effusion which pleases me. It is as free of dirt as Strange Fruit was full of it. Thus it will certainly be a disappointment to those connoisseurs of the pornographic who go in for literature for lust's sake. As well as to those of Miss Smith's following, who have labored under the delusion that somewhere in her fervor-packed being there was room for a trace of talent. Land Constitution. You know, the New York Herald Tribune called Killers of the Dream brave, honest, and heartrending. And you know, I had the most wonderful letter from a 95-year-old lady who had read it and told me that now that someone had finally told the truth, that she can die in peace. You know what I think? I think that every one of you out there should go out tomorrow and buy copies of both books and read them for yourself, just so you can make up your mind about it. And for anyone out there who might be thinking of writing yourselves, I can tell you that having your first book be a big, big bestseller is probably the worst thing that can happen to a serious writer. Don't you ever long for the fame that comes with it. You are called bitch and saint. You are called heroine and whore. You are praised for your courage and sneered at for your obscenity. You are made into a stereotypical image, and no one sees you as a person, whether they love and admire your book or hate and fear it. And all kinds of things that get into print that are not even remotely true. You are always misquoted, even when the interviewers are friendly, as they come to question you with their minds already made up and their questions formed and shaped to get a certain answer. I wonder why anybody who's ever gone through this sort of thing ever believes a word they read in a newspaper. But even I still do at times, and I have to keep reminding myself that the story may well be twisted or distorted or wholly untrue, just as so many stories on me were. And there is one story I would like to get straight right now. The title, Strange Fruit, is my own. The novel was first called Jordan is So Chilly, which I took from an old spiritual about God's people crossing the river into the promised land. But my publisher really wanted me to change it, so I agreed. Now, to me, the term strange fruit had nothing to do with lynching or the song about it by the same name that was recorded by Billie Holiday. I had used that phrase a long time before that in an essay when I had talked about what segregation had done to white culture as well as to black culture, and I had said that we are the strange fruit of that way of life. We who are white are the strange fruit. Yes, I would say that segregation is the theme of all my writing if we look at it in a bigger way than race. One finds it in some form wherever men try to shut themselves away from each other or from knowledge or from a reality that seems too full of danger. But those of us who feel free and don't need segregation, don't want it in any form, we often say to each other that we are wasting our creative lives fighting this monster. We hate it because it hurts us as writers and artists to always have to give so much of yourselves to it. And people call it your mission in life. And I think that's ghastly. I mean, who wants a mission? Sounds like some pompous little reformer, some little busybody running around trying to change everything all of the time, and I just don't like it. You go anywhere, you go to a party, and the first thing they say to you is something about race, something about segregation, and sometimes I'm polite, but sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I will have a real outburst, and I will say, do you know that the things that mean most to me are poetry and music and painting and philosophy? Those are the things that mean the most to me as Lillian Smith. So let's talk about anything, but let's get off race for a little while. So what else have I sacrificed? I have often had my life threatened, yes. I fear I have lost some old friends. I've also had some precious manuscripts destroyed in suspicious fires, including the only copy of the manuscript for the novel about China. And I have been blacklisted by quite a few publications. But try not to be a martyr about it. You know, I've often thought that if I were to New York to live, or to Paris to live, it all might begin to fade. It does hurt. But you know, I want it to hurt. Because I believe that the writer stops writing when the wound heals, and that we must keep the wound open. This is my home ground. I want my mind to range the whole world, but I want my mythic roots to stay here, the roots of my imagination to stay here where I belong. Once, I thought I wanted to be one of the world's finest writers. Now you tell me what that means. Now, all I want is to have done a good job. I believe that every creative act, every poem, every painting, every honest question or honest dissent, every gesture of courage and faith and mercy will count. Every new awareness will count. Every time we defend the human spirit, it will count. Every time we turn away from arrogance and lies, that will count. I hope I have not hurt too many people. I hope I've loved well and deeply. And I hope that none of my dreams will ever die. I do not fear death. To me, it is just a new beginning.
Lillian Smith died on September 28, 1966. She had left detailed directives for the conduct of her funeral, and her wishes were followed faithfully. First, there was a brief Methodist Episcopal service for the family and close friends in the living room in Laurel Falls, ending with her father's old daily benediction. She was then buried by the big chimney on the left-hand side. She preferred that the family not watch as she was laid into the grave, but asked that it be closed swiftly and flowers then spread over the ground. That afternoon, there was a memorial service to which she requested that all of the Ivyville colored community and other special friends from Clayton be invited, as well as friends from all over the world, near and far, who wanted to be there. She asked that the little colored and white children who were her neighbors meet the guests with trays of flowers, giving one to each guest with a smile, and that the music of Bach should be playing as they gathered. The service was very short, with readings from her book, The Journey, and at the close, a friend stood at the edge of the trees and sang, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." It was as she wished, and as she described it in her own words, "Death to me is a beautiful ceremonial, an escort into the unknown by one's friends."